With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Oh, there we go. It'd help if I turn my mic on. Welcome in, everybody. Thank you for being with us on this Friday. The weekend is upon us, so to all you tacticians out there, we appreciate you joining us and making us a part of your weekend, a part of the end of your week. Now, lots to get to today. One local story that reigns supreme. It's not even something that I have to give a lot of detail. It's just something that I think that you really need to be made aware of. And it's something that I've known about for a while, but I think this story just kind of brought it back up to my attention, which, by the way, this one actually comes from our news partners at WSFA, who was doing an inquiry on this. Apparently, the state of Alabama is still paying for Governor Bentley's legal fees. Yes, that's right, the LoveGov, who used improperly taxpayer money to help hide his affair from his wife, that LoveGov, Governor Bentley, his legal fees are being paid for by the state of Alabama. Now, just to give you sort of a understanding of how this happens, how this could take place, this has been going on for about 2 years now. So in the 2-year interim, where various lawsuits have come up against Governor Bentley, the state of Alabama, there's actually a law that they are obligated to pay the legal fees of an elected representative when they are defending themselves as a part of their roles in office. And so because of that, even though Bentley is no longer the governor, the state of Alabama has continued to pay his legal fees. How is this happening? It's something known as the General Liability Trust Fund. So what has been happening is that the state of Alabama sets aside a certain amount of money and puts it in a trust fund. And what that trust fund does is it's a bank account that's essentially there to be used specifically for liability or legal fees for people who are in elected office. Now, this is a pretty good perk, because if you get sued, even if you get sued personally, as long as it's a part of or a capacity of you serving in that elected office, this thing is here to essentially foot your legal fees for you. And one of the things that it kind of reminded me of, you may remember this story, and this isn't exactly the same thing, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. You remember when we heard the stories breaking about the slush funds that were created in D.C. that were specifically put in place to help fund the legal fees for elected officials that had been caught in sexual harassment cases? That's what was going on in Washington, that if someone was accused of sexual harassment, and that was a part of their service in public office, and unfortunately it's DC, so this happened a lot, whenever that took place, the taxpayers were the one paying for it. That there was money specifically set aside to deal with complaints of sexual harassment. Well, this General Liability Trust Fund is essentially the same thing, but not just for sexual harassment, for everything. So even though Governor Bentley, and this is the allegation that has been levied against him, even though Governor Bentley is no longer in office, and the specific charges were that he was abusing his power as the governor to be able to perpetrate these acts that he's being sued for, the state of Alabama still has to pay to defend him. This is such an absurd story, and it really is just a reminder to everybody of the reasons they hate government. The reason that people just, as a general rule, and I know there's exceptions to this, I'm not saying they're not, as a general rule, think of politicians as a bunch of crooks. Because of laws like this, where if you get in legal trouble, the state of Alabama actually has to fund your legal defense. And how much are we spending? Well, on Governor Bentley alone, there are 4 lawsuits that are currently being waged against him. The figure stands at $201,506 in wrongful termination suits. And so when he started firing people to cover up his affair, when he started firing people that were going to blow the whistle and let people know that he actually was misusing funds to cover up an affair that was going on between him and Rebecca Caldwell Mason, this is the amount of money that has been spent defending the governor. Now, the largest one by far is Spencer Collier. You may remember, and I'm not going to go over every detail of this story again, but Spencer Collier was the attorney general the head of ALEA at the time, and he was essentially the guy that figured out that Governor Bentley was using the resources of ALEA in terms of their assets, their officers, to help him cover up his affair. And Spencer Collier was saying, no more. And that's when he was fired by Governor Bentley. And so that suit has cost $130,000. There's another lawsuit by Lewis, which is $14,000. There's another by Nolan, $24,900, so almost $25,000. And then also there's one by Gibson, which is $32,000. So those are the 4 lawsuits that have been filed against him. And one thing that was really interesting about this, and WSFA just happened to notice a discrepancy between this and some of the records that they got back in 2017, which stated that the lawsuit that was given to the governor to fund his defense against the Lewis lawsuit showed that it was about a little over $30,000 that had been paid out to his legal fees. So the question is, why is it that they were reporting that it was only about $14,000 if it was actually a little over $30,000? Because that's a pretty big difference. That's about double what this particular tally that WSFA got back has claimed. So even though right now it seems as though the total is somewhere around 200,000, it could actually be an awful lot more. I'm not saying that for sure. They haven't had a chance to respond yet, and I want to give them a chance to explain why there's a discrepancy there. But if they're off by about the same amount in every other lawsuit that they're claiming that this is the amount that's been spent on it, then it would be about 400,000. Again, we don't know that. That's still speculation at this point. But the fact that there is a discrepancy there, that doesn't bode well. And keep in mind, that's a record from 2017, which means presumably there could be even more than $30,000 spent on it by now. We're here 2 years later. And so I don't know if there really even is a sure way to tell whether or not this 200,000 figure is accurate at this point. But nonetheless, that's what we have to operate off of now. And kudos to our news partners over at WSFA for doing some investigative journalism and some deep digging into this. Now, you remember that one of the reasons that Governor Bentley was elected in the first place was because he made a promise to the people of Alabama. He looked you in the eye and he said that I will not take any salary as the governor until we've balanced the budget. Now, the governor's salary is roughly $128,735. So, 6-figure salary, not ridiculously exorbitant. In fact, it's slightly below median when it comes to the other states. Our governor makes slightly less than the average on that. But still, you're looking at that, we already know for a fact that the baseline is $200,000 that we've spent on his legal fees. And it could be a lot more than that based on the discrepancy that we saw that was spotted by WSFA. The discrepancy that could have doubled it, so it could be up to $400,000. We're not really sure. And that's not counting all the money that was already wasted by Governor Bentley in wasting state resources trying to cover up his affair. You remember the infamous helicopter thing, where he presumably could have wasted the money to have them bring his wallet and did so via helicopter, which is ridiculous. And there's some speculation that that was connected to the Rebecca Caldwell Mason incident as well. But I'm just saying, if that's the case, and that's how much Bentley was making a year, looks like that wasn't really a bargain for Alabama. We might have saved some money in his tenure as governor on his salary, but that's putting a pretty significant cut into it if that's the case. Between this and the money that he spent to illegally cover up his affair, there's a good chance we, at best, came pretty close to breaking even. And so my point in all of this is Governor Bentley's governorship was certainly far more trouble and far more embarrassment than it was actually worth. But I gotta say, one thing that this brings up is that not only if you are the governor that you get your legal fees taken care of, but if you're one of the ruling class, in other words, if you're a senator or a representative, and something that involves you in the capacity of your job pops up, you get your defense paid for. Now, what's funny about this is if you were working in the private sector, working in a private company, and there was a lawsuit levied against you personally, your company would not pay for that. Now, if you do something and it's, within company policy or something like that, and they sue the company itself, then yes, of course, the legal team there at the company or the lawyer they have on retainer or whatever is probably going to wind up footing that bill. But here we have a case of Governor Bentley being sued personally and the state of Alabama stepping in and defending him legally, and it's not anybody's fault. That's just the law. The problem is the law needs to be fixed. And this general liability slush fund, in my opinion, needs to be gotten rid of. Must be nice to be a member of the ruling class. Have your lawsuits just taken care of for you as long as they were done in the capacity of your job. I mean, somebody couldn't sue you for a personal debt or something, and it has nothing to do with you being a senator or a representative, and then this fund wouldn't do anything for you. But I'm just saying, there are an awful lot of perks to being a member of the House or a member of the Senate in the state of Alabama, and unfortunately, this is one of the more unscrupulous ones that really needs to be gotten rid of post-haste. But sadly, the corruption and even though this is perfectly legal, and it's essentially money for nothing, and your chicks for free, even though it's perfectly legal for the governor to engage in this, there are other unscrupulous activities that are going on at the national level that do essentially the same thing. And as horrible as it is, this is the spot that we find ourselves in. Okay, this is interesting. So here's the thing, real quick before we move on to another story. It looks like my laptop's battery is winding down, and I actually forgot my power cord this morning. So this is going to be a really exciting show. It could go off at any minute. We could just stop broadcasting, and the only way you would know is that the video stopped. So I hope that that's not going to be an issue, but we'll just keep an eye on that. If all of a sudden my stream just stops for no reason, that's probably why. But nonetheless, there are elected officials that are getting away with an awful lot at the national and, weirdly enough, the international level as well. So this is a question that was asked by John Solomon over at The Hill. And I got to tell you, there is some sketchy stuff going on with some of the top Democrats, specifically one of the ones that is the front runner, despite him not actually having announced his campaign yet, Joe Biden. And we'll get into some of the specifics with Joe Biden here in a second, but this is an article from The Hill. Headline, Ukrainian to U.S. prosecutors, why don't you want our evidence on Democrats? So it starts out, Ukrainian law enforcement officials believe they have evidence of wrongdoing by American Democrats and their allies in Kyiv, ranging from 2016 election interference to obstructing criminal probes. But, they say, they've been thwarted in trying to get the Trump Justice Department to act. Kolensky Kulik, deputy head of the Prosecutor General's International League Cooperation Department, boy, that's a mouthful, told me that the other senior law enforcement officials tried unsuccessfully since last year to get visas from the United States Embassy to Kyiv to deliver their evidence to Washington. Now, the reason that this is somewhat sketchy is, and I'm not somebody that thinks that there is some kind of deep conspiracy that goes all the way to the top on this or anything, but it does seem odd that you have officials there in the Ukraine that claim that they have actual physical evidence that is important that needs to get into America, and that they are requesting visas from the State Department, and the State Department is saying no. Now, the State Department, in my opinion, is the department at the top that needs to be cleaned the most. It's got the most lifelong bureaucrats in it. It's got the people that have been there forever, and the policy never changes regardless of who's in power, regardless of who's in Congress or who's in the White House. The State Department is the definition of a political swamp. And I don't think that it's a mistake that the State Department, which is in charge of issuing these visas, are the ones denying these visas to Ukrainian officials that are saying, hey, we've got an awful lot of evidence that, by the way, may be criminal activity when it comes to some American Democrats. And the State Department, I don't think that it's a mistake that they're saying, nope, you can't do that. You can't actually get a visa to go to the United States to present this to the FBI or to present this to the proper authorities. So this would be corruption from elected officials and inside the State Department if this is actually what's going on. And I have reason to believe, based on some of the information in here, that it is. So it continues on. We were supposed to share this information during a working trip to the United States, Kulik told me in a wide-ranging interview. However, the U.S. ambassador blocked us from obtaining a visa. She didn't explicitly deny our visa, but she also didn't give it to us. So apparently, the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine is the one that called this shot. That when they found out about this, when they found out that this was what was going on, this was the reason that they were scheduled to go to the U.S., present this evidence, all of a sudden, our visas just got revoked. She never explicitly told us that the visas were getting revoked, but after meeting with this ambassador, all of a sudden, we couldn't get a visa. They were never presented to us. And it also says, one focus of the Ukrainian investigators, Kulik said, has been money spirited unlawfully out of Ukraine that moved to the United States by businessmen friendly to the prior pro-Russia regime of Viktor Yankovich. Interesting. Because do you know what is significant about that particular administration? Well, actually, several things. But what I'm specifically sort of hinting at here is, this is the guy that Paul Manafort was helping out. You remember Paul Manafort that was working within the Trump campaign for a month. He wasn't there very long because some of his corruption came to light and then Trump promptly fired him. But the point is, this is somebody with a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of friends in Washington. And remember that being a foreign agent in Ukraine and not registering for that and taking money from dark money from a ledger that we discovered in the Ukraine from the pro-Russian side of this, trying to get the pro-Russian regime elected. That's what got Paul Manafort in trouble in the first place. And so it seems sketchy here that it was Paul Manafort that was in bed with these people, and he's not the only American that was, he's just the most famous one. And that all of a sudden, people from that old regime are the ones that are apparently keeping them from getting this information to them, because it says that the focus of the investigators was money that was taken unlawfully out of Ukraine and moved to the United States by businessmen that were friendly to this administration. So it seems like there are an awful lot of players and an awful lot of people that are in on this. So it continues on. Ukrainian businessmen authorized payments for lobbying efforts directed at the U.S. government, he told me. In addition, these payments were made from funds that were acquired during the money laundering operation. We have information that a U.S. company was involved in these payments. That company is tied to one or more prominent Democrats, Ukrainian officials insist. In another instance, he said, Ukrainian authorities gathered evidence that money paid to an American Democrat allegedly was hidden by Ukraine's National Anti-Corruption Bureau. during the 2016 election under pressure from U.S. officials. Quote, in the course of this investigation, we found there was a situation during which the influence was exerted on NABU, that's the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, so that the name of the American would not be mentioned. Huh. Well, that's intriguing. So essentially, just to sum all that up and what that means, is we've got dirty money being used to influence the 2016 election by a company that is tied to American Democrats. And they're pressuring the Ukrainian government to keep quiet on it. So it's not the Republicans, but the Democrats that are involved in the scandal. They've got a company with ties to them that is laundering, and in other words, moving this money around and funneling it out of the Ukraine. And it's all being used to help influence the 2016 election. But I thought the Democrats were dead set against there being any sort of involvement in a foreign election. Wasn't that what we were always told? Isn't that the mantra that they kept chanting and beating their chest on when it came to the Trump administration, that how horrible it was that Russia tried to involve itself in the 2016 election, which, by the way, I agreed with. I think that's actually correct. But it seems to me they're really worried about that involvement, but not so worried about the involvement when it comes to American Democrats funneling money through foreign countries to try to influence the election. Then all of a sudden, it's really not that big a deal. Kind of like it wasn't all that big a deal when President Barack Obama was spending money trying to get Benjamin Netanyahu to no longer be the prime minister, to lose that election in Israel. Oh, and you know, guys like John Kerry going to Iran to try to convince their government to just continue to abide by the Iran deal, even though it's no longer in place. And it was really never in place in the first place because of the authority of the Constitution, but I won't go into all that right now. See, then getting involved in foreign governments, then it's all right, as long as it's Democrats doing it. And that seems to be what's going on here, and that's part of the reason that you're not hearing any of this from the media. So it continues to go on, and it gives sort of this laundry list of things that they claim that they have evidence on, and we don't know this for sure. Some of it is backed up by other evidence we have from other sources, but most of it we'll just kind of have to wait and see to see how much they actually have on it. So here it goes. But many of the allegations shared with me, more than half a dozen senior Ukrainian officials, are supported by evidence that emerged in recent U.S. court filings and intelligence reports. The Ukrainians told me their evidence includes sworn statements from 2 Ukrainian officials admitting that their agency tried to influence the 2016 U.S. presidential election in favor of Hillary Clinton. The effort included leaking the alleged ledger showing payments to then Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. Huh. Well, that's interesting. The effort actually included leaking an alleged ledger showing payments to the then Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. Huh. So the way that that ledger actually wound up in our possession, and by the way, I'm glad that it did. I'm glad that it did, because Paul Manafort needed to be nowhere near the Trump administration, and what's funny is long term, that probably wound up helping the Trump administration. I remember covering that story when it came out. So the way that we wound up with that was because there were efforts by Ukrainian officials to try to sway the election in Hillary Clinton's favor. So if anything remotely like that had happened with the Russians, oh, you better believe that Democrats would have hit the roof and talked about how corrupt the Trump campaign was, because Russia was actually trying to actively help the Trump administration out, the Trump campaign out. But here we have an evidence of a foreign power actually releasing things to try to help Hillary Clinton, and the media is not saying anything about it. Okay, let's go on. Contacts between the Democrat figures in Washington and Ukrainian officials that involved passing along dirt on Donald Trump. So this is just essentially more of the same thing that we just talked about. It's just less specific. So it's just figures in Washington and Ukrainian officials that were passing unscrupulous things about Donald Trump along. Financial records showing that a Ukrainian national gas company routed more than $3 million to an American accounts tied to Hunter Biden. We're going to get into details on that in just a second. That's Joe Biden's son. Hunter Biden, younger son of the then Vice President Joe Biden, who managed U.S.-Ukraine relations for the Obama administration. Biden's son served on the board of a Ukrainian national gas company, Burisma Holdings. Records that Vice President Biden pressured Ukrainian officials in March 2016 to fire the prosecutor who oversaw an investigation of Burisma Holdings and who planned to interview Hunter Biden about the financial transfers. So what's going on right there, they say that they have records on it. This is something that was an example of what I was telling you about before that we already knew, because frankly, Joe Biden was very vocal about it. He was actually bragging less than a year ago about getting this guy fired, the person that was looking into some of the money being moved around, one of the top prosecutors in Ukraine, that was looking into the deals that were going on that involved Joe Biden's son. So all of a sudden, somebody's investigating some companies that his son works for, and they decide, yeah, that guy needs to go. We don't need that guy to be hired here. And Joe Biden actually bragged about withholding an American loan, which would have been about $1 billion, and said that he's going to withhold it unless that guy gets fired. They're saying that they have more evidence on that they have records on that as well. Correspondence showing members of the State Department and U.S. Embassy in Kyiv inferred or applied pressure to criminal cases on Ukrainian soil. And then finally, disbursements of as much as $7 billion in Ukrainian funds that prosecutors believe may have been misappropriated or taken out of the country, including to the United States. Now, this one I'm really interested in because I'm not sure what they're talking about here. And maybe I just haven't heard about it. Maybe I haven't been able to connect the dots on my own. But this, to me, seems like a new allegation. Like I said, we already have evidence on some of this stuff. And they're claiming that they just have more evidence or evidence that might make the case stronger. This right here, the $7 million, $7 billion, I've not heard about this. And so this is, potentially a completely new allegation that's going on here. So I'm not really sure, but we will have to see. And then it ends up saying, Ukrainian officials say they don't want to hand the evidence to FBI agents working in Ukraine because they believe the Bureau has close relationship with the NABU and the U.S. Embassy. Quote, it is no secret in Ukrainian political circles that the NABU was created with American help and tried to exert an influence during the U.S. presidential election, Kyliku told me. So what they're saying is, the FBI agents that are working in Ukraine right now, they don't want to hand the evidence over to them directly. And the reason that they're afraid of that is because the same people that they have dirt on, that they have evidence on, that there was some kind of wrongdoing, those people were essentially put together. That organization was helped in its founding by the FBI agents, by the U.S. officials that are there, that they'd have to turn the papers over to. And this is the reason they're holding on to the evidence that they've got until they can get it into the hands of Americans here on American soil. And so the whole system is corrupt. Unfortunately, Ukraine, which is an amazing country, I love the country, I love the people there. And I mean, it's a great place. But the government is really bad. The government is insanely corrupt. It's been notorious for being corrupt for a long time. You remember that we actually did a special on this show not long after I got back from Ukraine, explaining how there are some government officials that are actually keeping charitable donations, and I'm talking like food and clothes and medicine, from orphans until they get a bribe out of it. I mean, that's about as a despicable human being as you can be. To want to get your palms greased, and if you don't, that you're going to keep medicine and toys and food from hungry children. I mean, there's a special circle in hell reserved for those people, so far as I'm concerned. But what we're looking at right here is sort of an example of that. They don't want to give it to anybody in the Ukraine because they're convinced that something bad will happen, they'll go missing, the evidence will never see the light of day. And this is the reason that they're trying to get these visas to come to America to blow the top off of this thing and expose it. And they can't get the visas because those same officials, presumably some of the ones that either they or somebody that they know or somebody that they work with, would get hurt by this evidence. They'd be caught in the crossfire. Those are the people that are responsible for issuing the visas themselves. And so the Ukrainians are standing there basically trying to figure out, well, what do? We can't trust the Ukrainian officials over here, and we can't trust the Americans that are working here in the Ukraine because they're all part of that corrupt political system. And those same people are keeping us from getting visas so that we can't take it to America and get this whole thing settled. So now what do we do? And this is the reason that they're really stuck in a rock and a hard place. And it's a shame, but they really can't trust anybody on the Ukrainian side or the American side because of the way that this thing all shakes out and comes together. And so it kind of goes to the end of this and wraps up this article. And Politico reported in 2017 on evidence of Ukraine's embassy helping with the Clinton campaign to discredit Trump. Quote, a Ukrainian-American operative who was consulting for the Democrat National Committee met with top officials in the Ukrainian embassy in Washington in an effort to expose ties between Trump, top campaign aide Paul Manafort, and Russia, the newspaper reported. Whoa. So what they're saying is that you had operatives that were actually working for the DNC, and that these operatives met with officials in the Ukrainian embassy in Washington to try to coordinate this effort. You know, the Democrats have been screaming collusion between Trump and Russia for a long time now, but this sounds like if they can prove it and it's true, that you've got maybe not criminal conspiracy, but definitely coordination between the Ukrainian government and the Clinton administration, and the Clinton campaign, rather, and the DNC. So again, it seems like the Democrats are horribly concerned with collusion when it's on the Republican side and not so concerned about it when it's on their side, especially if they think it might help them. Continues on. Separately, the conservative nonprofit Citizens United last month filed a lawsuit seeking to force the State Department to disclose all information it possesses about Hunter Biden and his business partners involved with Ukrainian-based Burmisa Holdings. That's the natural gas company that he was sitting on the board for. If Ukrainian prosecutors can augment their allegations with real evidence, there could be a true case of collusion worth investigating. The only question is why the U.S. government so far hasn't taken interest, and whether Attorney General Barr will change that. I got to tell you, this story, it's rotten to the core. I mean, it is absolutely grotesque what is being alleged about what's going on here. And yet, the Democrats seem completely disinterested in it. The media doesn't seem to want to pursue it, except for this one guy over at The Hill, which, you know, props to The Hill. And this guy, I don't even think he's a full staff reporter. I think that he's just an occasional contributor. But props to The Hill for publishing this story, even though it got very little recognition in the mainstream media. This is an actual case of a corrupt government keeping officials from delivering evidence to United States officials for fear that the evidence might wind up hurting some of their buddies. It might wind up hurting some of the people that they care about, which, by the way, presumably would be Democrats, because it specifically has to do with the relationships between Joe Biden and his son and the companies over there, and a coordination between Ukrainian American officials and the Ukrainian government, all of them being involved in this specifically to help Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Now, you compare that with a handful of Russian bots trying to drum up anti-Hillary Clinton sentiment, which was happening, and getting like 50 likes on Twitter. I'm sorry, there's no comparison. You have actual coordination in this scenario. You have no coordination when it comes to the Trump campaign and that investigation. And that's exactly what the Mueller report said. So that's what we know. Speaking of, the Mueller report is probably going to drop at some point next week. And so that's something that's going to be really interesting. We'll try to give you all the details that we can on that as well. Now, sort of in relation to this, one thing that really has been brewing for a while now, but the problem is there's not really anything technically illegal, technically nothing that you could nail somebody on with this, but it's still happening in the background, is that you have Russians and some of their dealings in the Ukraine have been incredibly sketchy, particularly with Joe Biden. And yeah, he's the former vice president of the United States, but let's also keep in mind that this is not a guy that is insignificant. Let's remember that when it comes to Joe Biden, he is technically the front runner. Now, he's leading in the polls. He hasn't actually declared his candidacy. And if I were Joe Biden, I wouldn't. But Joe Biden right now is leading in the polls. This is the man who could theoretically have a very, very real shot at being the next president of the United States. We need to know this about him. So Joe Biden was heavily involved in Ukrainian corruption, and he was sort of the front man when it came to this. And I tell you what, we'll go ahead and give you the details of that in just a second. We'll go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Abby Johnson is in the other room.
Here.
Our first order of business is to present Planned Parenthood's Employee of the Year Award. Abby Johnson.
This is Abby. She's our newest volunteer escort. Abby, this is Cheryl's Alessandro.
I'd be the youngest director in Planned Parenthood history.
You'll actually be in charge of the abortions at your clinic?
I have a chance to make a real difference.
No matter what you do for the rest of your life, you're still gonna be a baby killer.
The only thing that's changed is you, Abby. Can you even hear yourself talk right now about these procedures? These are little babies.
I'm not going to apologize for doing a job that helps women in crisis.
There's still a part of me that isn't sure.
I know. But the one thing that all experts agree on is that at this stage, the fetus can't feel anything.
Sorry to bother you, but they need an extra person in the back room. Are you free? I saw it, and it was like it was twisting and fighting for its life.
We commend the souls of these hundreds of children. And Lord, we pray to end abortion.
I really appreciate what you've done for us. I'll not forget it.
22,000 abortions. How do I even comprehend that?
Rough day at the office?
You can say that.
What are you doing?
It's your dad and me. You were our baby from the moment of conception.
We are paying you to be a perfect instrument of corporate policy. We are an abortion provider.
I can't be a part of this anymore. Everything that they told us is a lie.
Don't underestimate the repercussions of this. You gotta be careful.
Rhonda, please don't do this! Rhonda!
Let me tell you what's going to happen if you walk through that door.
Congratulations. You've made an enemy of one of the most powerful organizations on the planet.
And welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us through the break. We actually have a surprise guest, and that's the reason that you'll only be able to hear him, not actually see him. But here's what happened, and I think I mentioned it earlier in the show. My battery was about to die, and had that happened, the stream would have ended very abruptly because, of course, if there's no computer to stream it, can't actually be on the air. So because of that, my dad actually came and brought my power cord from the house for me, and I do really appreciate you helping me out on that. So welcome into the program, John from Millbrook.
Yeah, it's better to hear me than see me anyway. And hey to Julie. She's listening this afternoon.
Yeah, I actually really wish that I had a camera on you right now so the audience could watch you try to manage that mic.
Yeah, and I'm dressed a little different than you are too. They would not think that we were paired up together well.
Hey, come on. It's Friday. I have to be able to, T-shirt and hat.
Oh, I know that, but I'm talking about the way I'm dressed. I'm ready to go to a rodeo.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of that, how was the rodeo this year?
I only stuck my head in the door. I only do the livestock end of it pretty much.
Well,
really.
I know, yeah.
That's my responsibility with it. So the attendance could have been better. That's the politically correct way of putting it.
I actually never made it out this year, and that's one of the reasons I was asking. I hate that, but there was something going on the show actually was a big part of the reason I couldn't go.
But you do know that we have an event coming up, and if he sticks with it, our own Joe Hunk is going to be riding a bull.
Oh, yeah, I heard that you set that up.
Yeah, we set that up. That's for the Wetumpka FFA, and they're going, Joe says he's doing this. I think he's nuts.
Okay, so you guys know that on this program, I often ask for prayer requests, and I would really like to ask the audience to pray for Joe Hunk when doing that.
Well, maybe his wife will get a hold of him, and he'll have better sense than that. But it will be fun.
Joe has a child now. He has to think about that.
Yeah, he does, and he's still acting like a college kid in some ways. Because those animals don't play.
No.
They are the real deal.
Not at all.
So what have we got going on this afternoon, aside from the governor situation where the taxpayers stuck with both sides?
Yeah.
That's a pretty cool way to do things, though.
Yeah.
It's like you're suing yourself, and then you don't even have to pay for it. You know what I mean?
Well, actually, with a little more in-depth, I don't think we're actually paying for both sides. But here's what's going on. It's the wrongful termination lawsuit with Spencer Collier and some of the other people that Governor Bentley fired.
Mm-hmm.
So actually Spencer Collier and the other plaintiffs are the ones that are suing. And so it's not they're paying their own way.
Right.
Which if I had to pick one side, I would rather pick their side to pay for.
Yeah.
By a lot.
That makes more sense to me in some ways.
Right. But
because it's a state guy that did it to them.
Right. But, of course, with the slush fund that they've got to take care of all their legal fees in case they get in trouble while in office. I mean, you're the company that you work for. If somebody tries to sue you, they're not going to pay your lawyer.
No, I'll tell you this. As a teacher, we were on our own.
Yeah.
We might have representation, but you were like an independent agent from what I understood.
Well,
that's the way he made it seem anyway.
As I understand, isn't that one of the scare tactics that they use to try to get you to sign up for the union?
Every year.
Mm-hmm. So
just like clockwork.
So what the union does is they sort of feed off of that, and they say, well, if you don't join the teachers union, then you're just going to be on your own if you get sued.
Yeah, but we had our Ag Teachers Association. We kind of did our own thing. We were sort of independent anyway. We were a little different than they were.
I'm glad ag teachers are that way, though.
Well, we were kind of, we had our own folks to a degree, so.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I was talking about, though, to answer your earlier question, other than that, was it seems that the Democrats have been, for 2 years now, really, really concerned about collusion with foreign powers in the 2016 election. And then it turns out Mueller report says there was no coordination at all between the Trump administration and Russia. And then it turns out that over right next to Russia in the Ukraine, that there was a concerted effort and a coordination between Ukrainian officials and Americans in the DNC to try to help Hillary Clinton out in the election. And nobody's talking about that.
Hasn't a Democrat already been arrested?
In that?
Well, connected with that some way.
I think indicted. I think it was indicted. That was
not arrested?
That was breaking news, and I actually didn't get the name of the official before I came on because I was working on another story. But yeah, that's actually a different story, or that's the same story, but I don't know which one of those was involved in that. But what this one involves is that somehow, mysteriously, the State Department couldn't figure out a way to get visas to the people that wanted to drop the evidence off in Washington. They were supposed to get their visas, and then all of a sudden the State Department decided, and specifically the U.S. Ukrainian ambassador decided, yeah, you're not going to get your visas. And they don't want to give it to the officials over there, like the FBI agents that are stationed in Ukraine, because they're saying that the same organization that this evidence goes after, it was founded by American officials in the Ukraine.
You know what? You could have done some on-the-ground reporting about this stuff, couldn't you?
Well, I could have if I had known about the existence
That's what I
of
mean.
this story back
You
then.
need to smell a story better.
I was in Ivano-Frankivsk. I wouldn't have been near where all this happened anyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this happened in Kyiv. I only spent one night in Kyiv.
Well, I mean, you were in the neighborhood.
I was. I didn't speak the language.
Well, most of us can't understand what Trump and the Democrats are saying either. So
you got a good point there.
By the way,
but here's the crazy thing, and I'll just sort of give you the details on this one and let you respond to it. So Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, his son, along with John Kerry's son, because he and John Kerry are best friends, and John Kerry's stepson and Hunter Biden are best friends, they founded this company called Rosemont Capital. And Biden was Obama's point man in the Ukraine. He basically said, you're in charge of all our relations with the Ukraine.
Little Biden.
No, Joe
Big
Biden.
Biden.
Joe Biden, yeah.
Okay, well,
Hunter Biden was not involved in this part of it.
I got you. Go ahead.
So Joe Biden is basically the face of the U.S. other than the ambassador over in Ukraine for the Obama administration. And when that happened, U.S. Mag, this is how significant this was. U.S. Magazine said, quote, no one in the U.S. government has wielded more influence than Vice President Joe Biden. So Joe Biden's the guy in Ukraine. And he started a program that would send $1.8 billion loans and experts to Ukraine to help them develop natural gas. So that was the point of the program. $108 billion, or sorry, a $1.8 billion loan, and they're going to go send experts that are experts in natural gas to help them develop their technology. Guess which experts they sent?
I wouldn't know.
Hunter Biden.
Oh, I got you.
And his good friend.
So what is his expertise in natural gas?
He has exactly 0 years of experience in natural gas.
So in reality, being in the petroleum industry and what I actually have more, I could have been sent on that deal.
You could have.
A little bit better than he would have done probably.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that Ivy Leaguer up there was, I mean, I don't know where he went to school, but little Hunter Biden is doing this deal. I wonder how much money he made doing that.
Oh, I don't know.
$1.8 billion? That's a truckload of money.
And here's the thing. Hunter Biden and his buddy Devin Archer, those are the two experts that they sent over there to help them develop their technology. Neither one of them had ever worked with natural gas at all.
But they're the experts to make this deal.
Right. And so they're the ones that are sent over there. And what they do is they work for the biggest natural gas company in the Ukraine.
I thought they hated gas and all that.
Shh. No. They like it when it lines their pockets. Do you know what presidential candidate got more money from the oil companies than any other one in history?
I mean, I don't know. He hasn't run, so.
Barack Obama. Barack Obama got more than any. They give lip service to being
to all of that.
Tough on energy companies, but you know, when it's
they take their money.
They take their money. But anyway, so they wind up as board members on the biggest natural gas company in the Ukraine, Burisma. And the owners of Burisma are these two brutal, notorious dictators, and I know I'm butchering the names because they're Ukrainian. Mykolika Zerlevsky and Eeyore, not the Winnie the Pooh character. His name's Eeyore Kolomavsky. And by the way, this guy was so bad and so notorious for criminal activity, he was actually banned from the U.S., was not allowed to get a license, was not allowed to get a visa. But when that $1.8 billion that we talked about, when that $1.8 billion goes over to Ukraine, they've got to put it in a bank. Guess what bank it gets put in? The bank that's owned by the guy who also owns the natural gas company that just hired Hunter Biden.
Oh, what a tangled web we weave.
And then this money just kind of disappears and nobody can find it. About a year later, a watchdog group in the Ukraine finds out that one of the oligarchs that owned this bank, they found at least over $1 billion of it sort of circling around in offshore accounts owned by this same guy that hired Hunter Biden. That's a pretty good deal. To get a $1.8 billion of American taxpayer money to hire the vice president's son, That's doing all right.
That is doing all right.
And then, a few days after this deal goes through, Kolomowski, the guy who owns all of this, all of a sudden he gets a visa. So somebody that wasn't allowed to get a visa couldn't even come to the United States. Now he's on the board of directors for a gas company with the vice president's son, and now all of a sudden he can get a visa. Weird how that worked out. So Vice President Biden, after this takes place, Vice President Biden publicly threatens to pull a $1 billion loan to the Ukraine if their president doesn't fire the general prosecutor, alleging that he was corrupt and he needed to get him out of here. But guess what that general prosecutor was investigating when that took place?
I don't know.
The company that Hunter Biden works at.
Ah.
So when this whole thing's about to hit the fan...
You need a scorecard with this thing.
Oh, yeah. So when this thing's about to hit the fan, Hunter Biden's daddy, who's the vice president of the United States, just shows up and says, oh, we're going to withhold this fund unless that guy gets fired. And he does. And Joe Biden tried to paint it as, well, I was trying to get rid of him and this guy was corrupt. He even brags about this as recently as a year ago.
You know what I'm shocked about with all this?
What?
I haven't heard a word about this on the Progress Network.
Yeah, you're not going to see it on Progress or CNN or MSNBC. I haven't even seen it on Fox.
No. This is a pretty juicy little thing here.
But let's fast forward. It gets even better. Let's fast forward, and then Hunter's buddy, Devin Archer, one of the other experts in natural gas that was working for this gas company, he actually gets convicted for fraud and goes to prison. But in the records that turned up, over $3 billion in consulting fees came from...
Consulting for $3 billion.
Consulting fees for $3 billion came from this natural gas company, and guess where they went?
I don't know.
The company that was owned by Devin Archer and Hunter Biden.
Oh,
and John Kerry's stepson. So there's a lot of money changing hands in a lot of different ways. This is effectively, if you follow the money trail, this is like Joe Biden giving $1.8 billion to this Ukrainian guy so that he can turn around and pay consulting fees to the company of Joe Biden's son.
Let us not forget that he is the front runner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States, who they're saying in November they want him to unseat Donald Trump.
That's right.
Because of collusion. And because he's so in bed with the Russians.
And what's hilarious about this is that a lot of this was done in the coordination by the DNC. The administration that this happened under was the Russian-run administration, the one that was friendly to Russia and was okay with them annexing Crimea. The one that was actually on Putin's payroll that we found out about later. So if anything, there's Russian collusion between the Democrats, not Donald Trump's administration.
Remember the crack between the soundbite that wasn't supposed to be heard between Barack Obama?
Oh, you
and
mean
Putin?
that high? Well, it wasn't him and Putin. It was one of the Russian ambassadors that he said that tell Putin that I'll have more flexibility after the election.
After the election, yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. The Russians have always been more the allies of the Democrats than Republicans anyway.
Why,
You're a lot older than me, but even I'm young. Even though I'm only 29, I remember when they were always buddying up with the Russians.
Yeah, they vilified Reagan to the nth degree because of he called them the evil empire. I won't ever forget that.
Yep.
This is, it's like the MASH episode where the spy came in and the two intelligence agents came in.
Colonel Flagg,
and then they had the other guy that came in and they kept talking about which agency. And Hawkeye said, they're leaking all over each other. And that's kind of how it is with this thing.
That's kind of what it feels like. Yeah.
It does. And they're so tangled up with each other. And that's a tremendous amount of money. That's not, a few $100,000.
And 1.8 billion of it was taxpayer money.
That's what I mean. I mean, that's a chunk of money.
And you know what else is really bothersome about this?
You could have built a section of the wall with that.
I know, right? You could have built a lot of wall with 1.8 billion.
Absolutely.
And what's crazy about this? All of it's perfectly legal.
And why is that?
Because there's no law against it.
Well, now
there's no laws against it in Ukraine. Now, if they'd done this in America and this is where all this took place, it probably would be illegal. But as far as we know, at least based on the evidence that we have available to us right this second, and more could spring up when these guys ever do get their evidence to Washington. But right now, everything that we know is actually legal.
Well, now, I continue to hear on the progress side that Donald Trump has done a lot of this because of the hotel that he wanted in Russia, and he wanted to build a Trump Tower. He hadn't built it, I know, and Donald Jr.'s in bed with the Russians, and that's why they did all of that. But they don't have any evidence like this that
that's the difference.
Is concrete.
You can actually look this up online. There are checks and receipts. There's a paper trail
on this.
The only thing that you can't find is where that 1.8 billion went, and that's because as soon as it got into the bank, well, then it just vanished.
And I got a question too. That's completely off subject, but why would Joe Biden name his kid Hunter?
I don't know.
I mean, as much as he's against guns,
well, he's not against guns. He says that people should just fire 12 gauges into the air. You remember that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he was just saying you just fire it into the air. It's like, Vice President Biden, you do realize that's illegal, right?
Yeah, well,
that's one of my favorite Biden moments. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, he's more than just creepy old Uncle Joe, isn't he? Because
he's creepy for other reasons, not
just kissing people on the head or whatever it was, and making people feel uncomfortable, from what I understand.
Oh, you're going to get a kick out of this. Why don't we go ahead and go to the Daily Dose of Stupid? Because I know you're going to like this one. Well, if I can get it to come up. There we go.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
All right, so are you familiar with what Ilhan Omar said the other day about 9/11?
Okay, that's the Muslim congressman?
One of the two of them, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
that's
her
what
and
I meant.
Rashida Tlaib.
Yeah.
So she was doing a talk the other day, and she said that CARE was founded, and people were being critical of CARE and her work over there, and it's a pro-Muslim group. And she said that CARE was founded because Muslims were losing their civil liberties in the wake of 9/11, and the way she described it was because some people did some things on 9/11. I mean, very much trivializing it.
Taking away rights of Muslims, they take that away themselves by their own edicts from religious.
Well, that's true too. I mean, let's be honest. The Sharia law is not exactly something that protects the rights of people.
No, it doesn't.
But nonetheless, that was her argument, which, first of all, she's incorrect because CARE was actually founded before 9/11 anyway, by several years. And secondly, just the way that she referred to it as some people did some things as though it was just like, I don't know, going out to get ice cream as opposed to killing 3,000 Americans. That's just, I don't like the fact that she seems to want to downplay that.
Yeah, she should be ashamed of what people that carry the same faith did something like that.
Sure.
I mean, I would be if somebody claimed it in the name of the Christian God. I would be ashamed of them and distance myself from them and make them villains.
Right, and of course
we'll throw our people under the bus.
Well, I mean, and we ought to.
Sure, we should.
Absolutely.
The people that are involved in corruption and certainly something like that's done in the name of religious, and you don't throw them under the bus.
Well, but
that's
it is, and what bothers me about it is that she just tries to act as though it wasn't a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
But she just sort of says it in a passing statement that some people did something. And another thing too, I was not a big fan of what the Patriot Act turned into, and the lack of civil liberties, which, by the way, was something that I very much oppose. So I'm not saying she doesn't even have a point, but she acts as though Muslims were the only ones affected by that. In fact, I mean, all of us were affected by that. I mean, they don't just scan Muslims at the airport; they scan everybody.
No, as a matter of fact, they go out of their way to bypass them because of the way they're dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I go back to the story in Atlanta with you and my dad.
Right.
And, going to the baseball game, they pulled you out. You're what, 13?
Yeah, I don't know why, but it seems like every time there's some kind of security scan, I always get picked.
Yeah, but at that time, you were a foot shorter.
That's true.
And no facial hair, or you were just a little kid. And my dad is all of 5'7" on a good day.
Right.
And a little, I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing. He isn't exactly someone that you would pick out to do terrorist acts.
Right.
At all. Never have I seen anybody
specimen.
like. No, not at all. And that's a ridiculous thing to, I'm in favor of some profiling. I mean, you've got a profile to find out who the bad guys are.
Well, that's also true. But one thing that I was just sort of mentioning from this, and it's very stereotypical of the new left, as it were. Some of the people that are just up and coming, the progressives in the left wing of American politics. It seems like whenever they're dealing with something that they don't like, their response is always the same. It differs a little bit, but essentially it's all some form of playing the victim. And that's exactly what's going on here. While sort of not talking about the victims of 9/11, she talks about, well, the real travesty of 9/11 was that Muslims sometimes get racially profiled. Which, even if that were the case, let's not pretend that that's a bigger deal than murdering people.
And they come up with stats from somewhere out in the universe where they'll say, well, there have been more people killed by white supremacists than there have been.
Yeah, they said that this week too. And there's no truth to it whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, white supremacists are the people that are actually doing all the murder in the United States. It isn't.
No, it's not even close to that.
It isn't black and brown people. I mean, I don't care what color the people are anyway that's doing anything wrong.
Right.
But it doesn't matter about that.
But what's
part.
crazy about that, even in a country, because sometimes they'll try to bring that up in countries that are majority white, which even if the majority of those crimes were being done by white people, it doesn't mean proportionately it's the same.
Right.
But even in America, where over 70% of the population is white, Muslims still commit more terrorist acts by far. It's not even close. We looked at the statistics on a story I was doing a little while back. But nonetheless, when you're looking at it and when you understand that about it, it does paint it in a different light. But of course, because stupid begets stupid, we actually have a double daily dose of stupid. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez weighed in.
Can't have anything without her in this segment.
No, here we go. So this is a tweet by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She says, and this is in reference to Dan Crenshaw, who's another representative that was being critical of Ilhan Omar about saying some people who did something. She said, you refuse to co-sponsor the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund, yet have the audacity to drum up resentment towards Ilhan Omar with completely out of context quotes. In 2018, right-wing extremists were behind almost all domestic terrorist killings, which again we were just talking about, completely wrong. Why don't you go do something about that? So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez suggesting that Dan Crenshaw essentially isn't doing his part to combat terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Who here sees a problem with that statement? Do you remember who Dan Crenshaw is?
Not exactly, no. You have to help me out on that one.
He's the representative from Texas that has an eye patch.
Mm-hmm.
You know where he got that eye patch?
I don't know. Probably service of the country.
Afghanistan.
Ah.
And he also served in Iraq.
Hmm.
So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has done literally nothing her entire life, is saying that a war vet that has done several combat tours and has a Purple Heart, that's the reason that he has an eye patch today, he's not doing his part to stop terrorism.
Yeah.
All right, then.
When he got shot at and put his life on the line in his tours.
Dan Crenshaw has done more to stop terrorism than the vast majority of the American population, including the two of us.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But there's just such an ingratitude. And of course, like I said before, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez both, whenever they're attacked, they only know how to do one thing, and that's play the victim.
Mm-hmm.
But this time it kind of backfired on her.
Yeah, well, I guess we don't understand the brilliance that she has, because you would think that she's the smartest person on the planet.
The way they talk about her, you would think
she is
that's
a
certainly
genius,
not true.
and I know one thing she doesn't need to do. She needs really to stay away from anything that's related to agriculture, because anytime that she's opened her mouth about something like that, anybody that has walking around sense can tell that she is completely clueless.
Oh, you're talking about where she said that we need to feed cows different grains so that they won't produce as much methane?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was pretty bad.
They have a whole universe to absorb the methane gas that she's talking about. And I've been around some bovine methane gas in my life.
Oh, yeah, quite a bit.
It isn't pleasant, but it goes straight away from you. It goes right up into the atmosphere, and of course she thinks that is infinitesimal.
But now you know this, too. The majority of the methane that is produced by cattle isn't even produced by them defecating. It's actually produced by them burping.
Yeah, belching, because they're cud chewers, and they belch it up, and they're belching it up at that time. But nevertheless, what a ridiculous claim to make.
Well, and her suggestion was, we should just feed them grass, which is problematic for a number of reasons, but also that would actually produce more methane gas.
It probably would. Anything in cells that you eat up automatically has a decomposition of those cells, which releases gas. I mean, I know she doesn't know that, but it doesn't. She thinks you can change the feed and do that. But the original point, there isn't anything being harmed in the environment by the methane anyway.
Well, she acts as like cows are just a brand new addition to the ecosystem.
Right. They'd never been here before.
All right, then. Well, I tell you what, we need to go ahead and go to the chaplain's report. Thanks for being with us, John.
Sure, I enjoyed it.
And you probably saved the show, because I'm sure that my battery would be dead right now if you hadn't brought that by.
It was great to be on.
Thank you. We'll go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Daniel. We're continuing our series on Daniel, and the king has just finished this beautiful praise of God. King Nebuchadnezzar, who goodness knows has his problems and doesn't always get it right, he has just finished this amazing praise of God, this sort of prayer that he offers up, talking about God's greatness and how amazing it is that he has blessed him with Daniel and with his other servants, and that God has been good to him. And so there is both a level of humility and gratitude, and that's the passage that we just covered before going to this one. And yet, I do think it's a little odd that when he has another dream, and he's already, remember at this point in the book, he's already had his dreams interpreted by Daniel correctly once already. But yet when he has another dream, he goes to the other magicians to interpret his dream before Daniel. And I don't know if he just wanted to see if they could get this one right or what, but it does seem a little odd that the guy who really got the job and got where he is and got famous by being able to interpret the king's dream, he kind of goes to them first, and when they fail him, then he goes to Daniel. So I don't know why he chose to go there first. I think maybe that could be a sign of something that we as humans occasionally do as well. That even though we know that the right answer is to go to God immediately, to go to him with our concerns first, that sometimes despite knowing that and despite experience actually teaching us that, sometimes we still opt to try to use our own wisdom or the wisdom of others before we take it to God in prayer. And that in and of itself, I think, is a good lesson for us to learn. But we do want to go ahead and look at this passage in Daniel chapter 4, verses 8 through 9, where it says, "But finally Daniel came in before me." Keep in mind, this is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. "But finally Daniel came in before me, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I related a dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation." Now, I want to point out here that in Nebuchadnezzar's wisdom, he does know that Daniel has the power to interpret his dream. He does know from experience that this is a talent, an ability that Daniel has, and he understands that it is a supernatural ability. So there's a lot to get right here that you can praise Nebuchadnezzar on, but there's also stuff in here that he doesn't necessarily get right. And we want to kind of break those two down. First of all, since he does acknowledge that Daniel is the person to go to, he acknowledges that because God has blessed him with this supernatural power to interpret dreams, he correctly looks at the situation and says, Daniel's the one I need to go to. Even though he went to the other magicians first, he still realizes Daniel is the one that has the ability to do this, and he has a lot of confidence in Daniel's ability. So there, he is right. But one thing that I do want you to notice here, that he seems to put an awful lot of the emphasis on Daniel and not God. And this is another mistake that even modern Christians can make from time to time. And I tell people this all the time when they're impressed by or compliment me on saying things that are wise or profound. Sometimes I do come up with my own stuff, but 9 times out of 10, my response to that is, look, I didn't come up with this. I'm just borrowing it from God's word. I'm not the guy who invented water. I just happen to know where there's a well. That's all I am. I'm just a messenger. And by the way, if you look back at the first chapter of Daniel, that's exactly the stance that Daniel takes too. Daniel acknowledges that his abilities and his powers, they're not his. They come from God. And he's told Nebuchadnezzar this on multiple occasions, and yet it seems as though Nebuchadnezzar still seems stuck on referring to Daniel as the one that has the power, that has the ability. He does say that there's a spirit of the holy gods inside of him, but he still seems to be dangerously close to putting the emphasis on Daniel and not God. And this is a trap that we can fall into. We all have friends that we admire or we think that are wise or that happen to have a pretty good handle on the Bible and some of the precepts taught within it. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But we also have to recognize that they're just messengers and humans too. Even when John was confronted with an angel in the book of Revelation and he fell down and started worshiping, the angel was like, no, you misunderstand. I'm not God. I'm just an angel. Don't worship me. I'm a messenger just like you are. There is only one that is actually worthy of worship. There's only one that is actually worthy of that level of praise and admiration. And it's not John, and it's not the angels, and it's not Daniel. And it's not our preachers, and it's not our parents. It's God. So while there might be a lot of wisdom that comes from some of these individuals, youth ministers, college ministers, preachers that we happen to know, or just random people that happen to be very knowledgeable about the Bible, even though those can be a great blessing in our life. And Nebuchadnezzar is right to realize that Daniel is a blessing in his life. We need to also acknowledge that any wisdom that they have, or any intelligence that they have, or compassion, or whatever else it is, we have to remember that God gave that to them. That he's really the one, that he's the source of it, and because of that, he's the only one that we ought to actually worship. And the thing about Nebuchadnezzar that is unfortunate here is he kind of tries to have his boot in both camps. He sort of wants to have one foot on the God is almighty and God is the most powerful side, and he also kind of wants at least one foot in the other camp, which is there's still all these other gods and idols that I continue to worship. And this is something that Israel struggled with quite a bit. So Nebuchadnezzar's not alone in this. Unfortunately, the history of Israel, for the most part, is Israel struggling with the sin of adultery. And when I say adultery, I mean spiritual adultery. Idolatry. You see, they were worshiping idols, and they were worshiping other gods, and it's not that they didn't believe in their God. Obviously, they believed in their God, and they believed that their God was powerful and important because they had seen some of the wonders and heard his prophets, but they believed that that was just one God of a lot of gods, and maybe even God's the most powerful, but that doesn't mean the other gods aren't still out there, and they don't still have power, and we shouldn't worship them as well. Unfortunately, this was a trap that Israel found itself in over and over and over again. Despite the fact that the old law is very clear, there is one God and you do not worship idols. Despite this, Israel fell into this so many times, sometimes even from the top, with kings and queens and officials engaging in worship and trying to force other people to engage in this worship as well. And so, unfortunately, this was a common problem, not only with Nebuchadnezzar, but with God's own chosen people in this period as well. And it is so sad to see that he has this sort of idea that he can worship God and acknowledge him, but also worship all these other gods and acknowledge them as well, and maybe just give a little extra worship to the most powerful God, which he asserts is Daniel's God. You can't serve two masters. You can't take yourself in two directions, and that's the thing about God. God wants all of you wholly and completely devoted to him. In fact, when I talked about this at the beginning, you may recall I said they were guilty of the sin of adultery. Probably the best way that this is described is in the book of Hosea, where God actually has the prophet Hosea marry a prostitute to sort of model the way that God feels towards Israel. This is somebody that he's supposed to be committed to, and that is supposed to be committed to him, and they're supposed to belong to each other in an exclusive way. And yet, the Israelites and Nebuchadnezzar here would so often, even though they know that that's the way they actually should be, and have enough information that they ought to get that lesson through by now, that ought to be getting through to them, they still continue to go out and worship these other gods. And unfortunately, often it led to Israel's downfall, and it leads to Nebuchadnezzar's downfall as well. Because God will not tolerate a dual loyalty. He deserves our complete loyalty, just like a spouse. That once we decide that we're going to follow God, that means we don't follow anything else. And that would mean other idols as well, sure. But it would also mean things like wealth, or fame, or other people that we find particularly interesting or attractive, or whatever else it may be. Because there are so many things that we can worship in this world that is not God. Whether it's a significant other, or a house, or a job, there is nothing that needs to take us away from our duties and our responsibilities when it comes to our relationship with God. Because God will not tolerate spiritual adultery. He will not tolerate us splitting our loyalty between him and something else. Because doing so only hurts us. Anything else, and we might as well not have a connection to him at all. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.